The boardroom gleamed like an altar to money and power. The long table stretched beneath chandeliers that threw white light onto polished wood, and 12 directors sat in silence, their pens resting on leather folders. Damien Kyle leaned forward at the head, tie perfectly knotted, smile sharp as glass. He wasn't just addressing the board, he was staging a performance meant to carve me out of Ironvale's history. "You're a relic, Claudine," he said, savoring each word. "Ironvale doesn't need anchors. It needs wings. And I found someone with the vision to take us there." His hand gestured toward the doorway, where Marissa Vale stepped in, heels clicking on the marble floor. Her dress shimmered under the fluorescent light, her youth a deliberate contrast to my graying hair. The board shifted, some clearing their throats, others lowering their eyes. Not one voice rose to defend me. 25 years of building the skeleton of this empire gone with a smirk and a flourish. Damien slid a folder across the table. My name stamped in red. "Your termination papers. Effective immediately." My breath stilled, but I would not give him the satisfaction of collapse. I folded my hands in my lap, forcing my pulse to slow. My mind replayed the crises I had carried Ironvale through Zurich in 2008 Singapore when vendors threatened to walk. Midnight calls that kept this company alive, all erased by a man who had never known a sleepless night without champagne at arm's reach. I rose from my chair. The room seemed to shrink around me as I gathered my things, the weight of silence heavier than any insult. Even the hum of the air vents sounded like an accusation. The security officers by the door didn't move. They didn't need to. My heels echoed down the corridor, each step pulling me further from a life I had once called my own. In the elevator, my reflection stared back from golden doors' tired eyes, spine still straight, badge clutched so tight it cut into my palm. When the doors closed, I exhaled slowly. Silence had been forced on me, but it would not be wasted. I stepped out into the marble lobby, already carrying the thought of what came next, the night after my dismissal. I sat at the kitchen table in my Brooklyn apartment, badge still in my hand, its plastic edges pressing into my skin. 25 years reduced to this small square of nothing. My mind drifted back to Zurich, 2008. The world was collapsing, banks choking on debt, and Ironvale's survival hung by a thread. I was the one who kept the current flowing. I remember sitting in a windowless conference room with 3 phones pressed to my ears, rerouting funds, activating clauses I had embedded years earlier, while executives paced outside waiting for a miracle. When the markets opened, Ironvale stood while competitors fell. Damien shook hands in front of cameras as if he had pulled the company back from the brink. I went home to an empty hotel room, too tired even to eat. 2 years later, in Singapore, my father's voice broke through the static of an overseas call. He was fading. My sister said. I was in the middle of negotiations with a vendor whose cooperation would decide whether Ironvale's next expansion lived or died. I stayed at the table. Hours later, the call came again. He was gone. I signed the contract with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. Birthdays blurred into layovers, anniversaries into late-night flights. My daughter, Adele, once left a message on my phone, her voice trembling with anger. "You missed my graduation. Mom, again." I played it in an airport lounge, surrounded by strangers, unable to answer her rage with anything but silence. Out of those sacrifices, I built the Sentinel framework, contracts laced with contingencies, code woven with redundancies, hidden locks that shielded Ironvale when storms came. It was invisible, but it was alive, pulsing beneath the company's surface like a second nervous system. Now, in the stillness of my kitchen, It felt like the only proof I had ever existed inside those walls. My family resented me, the board discarded me, and Damien mocked me as a relic. Yet Ironvale still breathed through the system I created, and soon they would learn that without me, nothing would run at all. A week later, Ironvale held a press briefing on the 48th floor. The cameras panned across the boardroom, catching Marissa Vale at the podium in a crimson dress that glittered under the lights. Her slides glowed on the screens behind her, all polished graphs and sweeping slogans: innovation, disruption, destiny. I recognized the phrases instantly. They came straight from the PR department's playbook. She read them aloud as if unveiling revelations, pausing dramatically between lines. The directors nodded politely, though some shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking from the screen to her painted smile. I saw the employees standing along the back wall whispering, one muttering just loud enough for the microphone to catch. "She's never even signed a vendor contract." Damien leaned against the head of the table, arms crossed, grin wide, as if she were proof of his vision. "This is the new Ironvale," he announced, sweeping his hand toward her. Fresh blood, fearless energy, no baggage. The board clapped on cue. From my kitchen in Brooklyn, the news feed played on my laptop. The screen froze for a moment on Marissa's face, lips curved in a self-satisfied smile. I tightened my jaw, remembering the nights I spent tracing supply chains across 3 continents, the months I missed of Adele's childhood, the hours lost inside windowless data centers while people like Marissa slept soundly. I muted the broadcast and let the silence settle. Vanity could parade in designer dresses and PowerPoint slides, but Ironvale's veins still pulsed with the locks and safeguards I had buried deep. Applause couldn't override code, and empty slogans couldn't sign contracts. On the table beside me, my old laptop sat closed, the faint scratch marks on its cover catching the light. My fingers brushed its surface, a reminder of the world Marissa would never understand. She could wear the title, but she would never hold the backbone of the empire. By the time the broadcast ended, Damien was basking in the flash of cameras, as if history had been rewritten to erase me. I pressed my palm flat against the laptop and opened it once more. The old laptop hummed to life with a faint whir, its screen glowing pale against the dim kitchen light. My password still worked, letters typed from muscle memory, and then the familiar interface appeared lines of code, dormant but never erased. My creation had waited in silence, just as I had. The Sentinel framework opened like a map of arteries. Thousands of nodes, contracts, and redundancies pulsed quietly, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Beneath its surface lived the protocol I had built for a day I prayed would never come. The fail-safe, years earlier. I had buried it in the fine print of vendor agreements and compliance clauses, threading it through logistics and banking contracts. At the time, it was a precaution, a safeguard in case authority at Ironvale ever fell into the wrong hands. The rule was simple: if my digital credentials were removed without authorized succession, the system would recognize it as sabotage. Every transaction requiring high-level clearance would lock. No exceptions, no overrides. I remembered the night I coded the first sequence. Rain striking the Zurich windows, exhaustion weighing on me after days of negotiations. I had called it my invisible insurance, a firewall against arrogance and ignorance. No one else at the table noticed the extra clauses I slipped into agreements. To them, they were harmless redundancies. To me, they were iron doors that could never be forced open. Now, years later, the system stirred again, scanning its environment, registering that my credentials had been stripped. It was already shifting into defense mode. Quietly but relentlessly, I leaned back, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the steady pulse of code on the screen. Damien thought my silence meant defeat. He thought replacing me erased what I had built. But the system didn't need applause or cameras. It obeyed rules written in logic, not vanity. I closed my eyes for a moment, then whispered into the quiet, "Let's see how long you last without me." The laptop screen flickered as the first alert pinged from across the Pacific, and I knew the dominoes had already begun to fall. The first crack appeared on the West Coast. A billion-dollar shipment of microprocessors sat idle in the Los Angeles port, containers stacked like tombstones under a gray sky. Cranes froze in place, paperwork stalled, engines idled as if waiting for a ghost's permission. The clearance code was missing. My code. Half a world away. Tokyo executives paced glass offices while contracts blinked incomplete on their screens. Compliance checks flagged anomalies that no override could erase. My absence had triggered the locks exactly as I designed them. The system had decided Ironvale no longer had authority to move forward. By morning, the media caught wind. Damien strode into interviews with his trademark grin, the cameras drinking in his rehearsed calm. "Just turbulence," he said, brushing it off with the arrogance of a man who thought charm could bend steel. "We'll clear it by tonight." His confidence played well on television, but behind the gloss, whispers were already spreading across trading floors and logistics hubs. I watched the news feed from my apartment, volume low, hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee. I didn't need the reports to know what was happening. The framework pulsed in my laptop, glowing threads showing blockages forming across the globe. Every lock was a reminder that Ironvale could not erase me without consequence. That evening, Adele stood in the doorway, her textbooks tucked under one arm. Her eyes narrowed, searching my face. "Did you know this would happen?" she asked, voice taut with something between accusation and fear. I met her gaze but said nothing. Words would only sharpen the wound. She waited a moment longer, then turned away, her silence cutting deeper than her question. When the door clicked shut behind her, I looked back at the screen. Los Angeles, Tokyo, and soon more. The first fractures had surfaced, and the dominoes were only beginning to tip. The first fracture had barely settled when the leaks surfaced. Someone inside Ironvale forwarded an internal memo to the press, a warning drafted by the company's own lawyers months ago. It spelled out, in plain language, that my digital certificates were woven into the majority of Ironvale's high-value contracts, and that they could not be substituted without legal amendment. Removing me had triggered invalidation. By noon, CNBC flashed a red banner across the screen, Ironvale's 7.8B at risk. Anchors debated whether negligence or fraud had put the company on the brink. Analysts replayed clips of Damien smiling through interviews the day before, mocking his bravado now that the truth had surfaced. Inside the Park Avenue Tower, the board convened in their glass-walled conference room, the city skyline glaring back at them. Reports say their voices carried down the hallway, tense and sharp. I didn't need a transcript to imagine the panic the men who had clapped politely at my dismissal, now calculating what their silence might cost them. And then came Marissa's grand debut. CNBC granted her a primetime slot, hoping for clarity from the so-called Chief Strategy Officer. She leaned across the desk in a jewel-toned dress and said with a confident smile, "We'll just override the codes." I almost laughed. The interviewer raised an eyebrow. "Pushing override them. Even the leaked memo says they can't be bypassed." Marissa's smile faltered, her gaze darting off camera before she stammered, "Well, technicalities aside, Damien has it under control." The clip went viral within an hour, stock traders circulating it with captions like Ironvale strategy, denial. Shares plunged faster. Back in my apartment, I let the sound play without volume. Watching Damien's empire wobble under the weight of his mistress's empty words filled me not with joy, but with inevitability. He had paraded vanity as vision, and now vanity was unraveling in front of millions. When the market closed that evening, Ironvale had lost another $1 billion in value, and the panic was no longer confined to the trading floor. It was spreading straight into the boardroom. By the next morning, the Park Avenue Tower had transformed its executive suite into a war room. Screens lined the walls, streams of red error messages scrolling faster than anyone could read. The IT engineers sat hunched over keyboards, eyes bloodshot, fingers moving in frantic rhythm. Damien stalked behind them like a general at war, barking orders to break through and force the overrides. Each attempt ended the same way: access denied. The integrity locks I had written years ago replicated faster the harder they pushed. One failed command became 5, then 50, spreading through the system like cracks in ice. Jonas Reddick, barely 26, stood at the edge of the room clutching a notebook. He had once been an intern in my department, wide-eyed, eager to learn. Now his face was pale under the fluorescent light. When Damien shouted again to override everything, Jonas whispered, almost to himself, "She taught us never to override integrity locks." The room went still for a moment. A few engineers glanced at him, then back at their screens. But I saw the flicker in their expressions when the words sank in. It wasn't rebellion yet, but it was memory, the echo of the rules I had drilled into them during long nights of training. That afternoon, as I sat by my kitchen window, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "We still follow your rules." Minutes later, another arrived. "Your framework protects us. Even now." I set the phone down and let the quiet wash over me. Loyalty could not be ordered or paraded at a press conference. It had to be earned in the shadows, in the hours when no one watched. Those engineers weren't resisting for me, they were resisting because they knew the system had been built to guard them, not destroy them. And with every error flashing across those monitors, their faith in me deepened, while their faith in Damien cracked. By nightfall, the war room was still lit, but the true power had already shifted far from his hands. The fractures that had begun in whispers thundered into full collapse overnight. In São Paulo, warehouses locked themselves into paralysis, forklifts idle, crates sealed behind electronic gates that refused every clearance code. Frankfurt traders woke to find entire accounts frozen mid-transfer, billions suspended in digital limbo. In Tokyo, supply chains buckled. Shipments stacked uselessly as contracts marked unauthorized. By dawn, the total was clear: 7.8 billion erased in less than 12 hours. The boardroom in Manhattan erupted. Directors who once nodded along to Damien's speeches now hurled questions sharp enough to cut through the glass walls. Damien stood at the head of the table, tie loosened, eyes bloodshot, insisting it was sabotage. His voice rose louder with every accusation. "This was deliberate," he barked. "She planted this years ago." A director slammed his palm on the table. "No, this is negligence. You were warned. We all saw the memo." The words hung heavy in the silence that followed, and for the first time, Damien faltered. Meanwhile, Marissa Vale had retreated to the ladies' lounge, mascara streaked down her cheeks. Someone recorded her sobbing into her phone, muttering that she never signed up for this. Within hours, the clip leaked online. It spread across social media with captions mocking the so-called chief strategy officer. Her humiliation became another headline, another nail in the coffin of Damien's credibility. I watched the chaos from my apartment. The television muted. Stock tickers bled red across the bottom of the screen. Ironvale's valuation collapsing in real time. The anchors didn't bother masking their disbelief anymore. The downfall was too spectacular, too swift. The system was doing exactly what I designed it to do: refuse to serve incompetence, hold integrity above arrogance. Damien had mocked me as obsolete, but it was his empire that now looked like a relic, rotting in front of the world. And as the city outside my window stirred awake, I knew the next move wouldn't come from the markets or the board. It would come from him. The call came just after midnight. My apartment quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I let the phone ring twice before picking it up. His voice, usually smooth with arrogance, broke across the line like glass under pressure. "Claudine," Damien rasped. "We don't have time for grudges. I'll give you anything. Your office back. Your name on the building. Hell, your name on the patents. Just fix this." I leaned back in my chair, the glow of my laptop reflecting the collapse of his empire in real time. Ships stranded in Sao Paulo, transfers frozen in Frankfurt, warehouses choking supply chains from Tokyo to Los Angeles. The framework didn't care about titles or bribes. It only obeyed integrity. He kept talking, words spilling in a rush, each one sharper with panic. The board's breathing down my neck. Investors are threatening to pull out. You want recognition? Take it. You want power? It's yours. Just unlock the system. I stayed silent. I wanted him to feel the weight of it, the quiet he had once used to humiliate me now pressing against his chest like a stone. The longer I said nothing, the more ragged his breathing grew. Finally, I spoke, my voice steady, each word cutting through his desperation. "You replaced me with vanity. Now vanity will bury you." There was a pause, a sound like the air leaving a room, and then the slam of the phone disconnecting. The line went dead. I set the receiver down gently, my hand steady. The silence that followed was different than the one in the boardroom weeks earlier. This was not humiliation. This was control. For the first time in 25 years, silence belonged to me. Outside, the city pulsed with restless energy. But in my apartment, the night was still. I closed the laptop, the figures still tumbling downward in my mind, and prepared for the call I knew would come with the morning. The morning came with headlines scrolling across every financial network: Ironvale CEO ousted after historic collapse. Cameras swarmed outside the Park Avenue tower, catching Damien's red face as security escorted him out. Marissa trailed behind him, eyes down, her arm clutched by another guard. The empire they thought invincible had turned on them with the same speed they once wielded against me. The board's vote had been swift, unanimous. Not one hand lifted to defend him. By the afternoon, my name filled the news cycle, though I had never asked for it. The silent architect behind Ironvale's survival. Reporters camped outside my building, calling for a statement, an interview, a comment on Damien's fall. I drew the blinds and let the phone ring unanswered. Silence was enough. Later that week, I met Adele in Prospect Park. The autumn air carried the scent of damp leaves, the lake rippling under a pale sun. We walked slowly, the city's noise softened by the trees around us. She slipped her arm through mine, no longer guarded, no longer angry. "I used to hate how much you gave them," she said, her voice quiet. "But now I see why you fought so hard." I looked at her, the daughter who had grown up in the shadows of my sacrifices, and felt a weight lift. Justice isn't noise, I told her. It's what remains when the noise collapses. I never returned to Ironvale. Instead, I signed papers establishing the Mercer Fellowship, funding young women who wanted to build system strategy the way I once did, without being erased, Every scholarship carried the same principle I had coded into sentinel integrity above arrogance. When the press finally moved on to the next scandal, I remained in the quiet of my own making. No titles, no podiums, no applause. Just the certainty that my legacy would outlive the men who tried to bury it. Triumph wasn't in their downfall, it was in what endured after. And as Adele smiled beside me, I knew I had finally written the ending on my own terms.